Hello, and welcome to Field Lab Earth, the podcast that's all about past and present advances in the fields of agronomic, crop, soil, and environmental sciences. Today, we'll be talking to Dr. Joel Cohen about Nikolai Vavilov. Vavilov was an agronomist and seed collector whose life spanned the regimes of Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin. These were years plagued by extreme famine, especially in the Ukraine. Vavilov strove to follow Mendelian science and practices to improve plant breeding programs, seed conservation, and food security. He traveled to and collected seed from over 50 countries in his lifetime and was the founder of one of the world's oldest seed banks. However, he died defamed and imprisoned with his name struck from the history books. This episode, in honor of Seed Week, Joel joins us to discuss Vavilov's work, the ongoing efforts to restore his reputation, and why his legacy matters today. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but before we dive in, we wanted to thank our sponsors, starting with Meter Group. Meter specializes in robust soil moisture sensing, innovative weather monitoring, cloud data logging, advanced data visualization software, and more. Their well-published scientific instrumentation is used worldwide in universities, research and testing labs, government agencies, agriculture, and industrial applications. Find world-class webinars about the science behind environmental measurements at metergroup.com/fieldlabearth. Our second sponsor is Gazmat Technologies, the maker of the GT5000 Terra, the smallest portable FTIR multi-gas analyzer for greenhouse gas and environmental research. Measure carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, methane, nitrous oxide, nitric oxide, nitrogen dioxide, ammonia, and water vapor in real time simultaneously from static or automated chambers. Visit www.gazmat.com, that's Gazmat spelled Gasmet, or email sales@gazmat.com for more information. I'm your host, Abby Morrison. Let's talk about science. Hi everyone, welcome to the show today. Today we have Joel Cohen with us. Joel's career began as an agricultural Peace Corps volunteer in Nepal. After returning home, he graduated with a doctorate in plant breeding and genetics and worked as a research station manager for hybrid seed corn. 5 years later, he returned to international civil service, assisting research programs in developing countries. He then went on to education and began teaching the next generation of biology students. Presently, he is a visiting scholar with the Environment School at Duke University. Welcome to the show today, Joel. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here.
Great. We are so happy to have you. Today we are talking about Nikolai Vavilov. So can you just give us some general background about kind of who he is, maybe the setting that he was growing up and doing his work in, to give us some context for our listeners?
Yes, I'd be glad to. So Nikolai Vavilov was born in 1887, and the reason that's important is that his lifetime stretches through a number of great epochs in Russian history. And his death occurred in 1943, so he stretches all the way from the Tsarist period through the Russian Revolution and actually just into World War II. When he was born, he was the eldest son of a family that eventually, where he would have two sisters and a younger brother. And they were rather well off for those days, and so they gave a lot of attention to all of their children for education, and Vavilav benefited from that greatly. So the first period of his life, which I kind of call the academic years, he was able to study very intently and graduated from the Moscow Agricultural Institute in 1911, and after that was able to make trips to Europe and actually begin his continuous studies in Europe, and then come back to Russia, and then developed into one of the most important agricultural geneticists really that we have ever seen, and from whom we have many important writings.
Great. That is a wonderful overview of some very pertinent information that will come back later, I am sure. But despite kind of this promising start and a lot of the promising work he was doing, he really faced some big challenges in his lifetime. Both some of these leaders themselves Stalin himself, I guess, as well as time was kind of a big enemy of his, which is kind of the focus of the paper you wrote. Can you tell us more about the challenges he faced in his lifetime?
Sure. So let's try to look at this from the perspective that Vavilav, I see him as living through four kind of personal eras. And the first, as I mentioned, was his academic years. Secondly, I call him like a revolutionary professional. And this is important because during the whole time of the revolution, when Lenin eventually came to power and the Bolsheviks had seized power, through all that tumult and change, Vavilov was able to continue his professional development. He grew immensely. He was a scholar, a writer, and eventually achieved his first position as a professor in an agricultural school. So we have that period going on, and under Lenin, he was really able to prosper and grow. Then we have the third period where he becomes Stalin's scapegoat. And this is where the pressure of time really begins to mount up, because the longer Stalin is in power, the less enchanted with Vavilov's message and the way he's conducting science continues. And then finally, of course, we enter the last period where he is forced into basically execution and then is rehabilitated posthumously by Khrushchev. So during these four periods, we see that time plays a crucial role in each of them. And when we get to the point where he has become director of many of the institutes, if not all, most of the important institutes of agriculture in Russia, he's fighting a battle of political time, which the revolutionaries are concerned with, versus the agronomic time it takes to really be able to turn out varieties and improve crops sufficiently to deal with the population and the famine cycle that exists inside Russia. So that is one of the reasons in the paper in crop science I focus a lot on time as his biggest enemy, because there weren't shortcuts to these agronomic cycles. And one of the most dangerous positions that evolved from that was coming up against a person who, for political reasons, tried to portray agriculture, vernalization, and so forth as having a shortcut to it. And that was politically acceptable, much more than the Mendelian process that Vavilov came back and was strengthening throughout his institutes.
Can you, just for listeners who aren't familiar with those terms, can you kind of explain like what vernalization is versus the Mendelian approach? Like, what are those two viewpoints, scientifically speaking?
All right, so in the time that Vavilov was working, another scientist was also employing the tools of vernalization, which is really a seed treatment. Now, the reason that this became important is that it kind of harmonized with the Soviet viewpoint at that time of their political philosophies. And the Soviets began to realize that given where they were coming from, the Tsarist period, the serfdom, and so forth, they weren't going to convert those masses of people to a communist philosophy overnight. And so it was important to them to think that by taking in the communist message and so forth, they could begin to change people. And that was more or less what Lysenko was saying about his type of science, that it could be imbued from the environment and it would begin to change things in the next cycle. So what he applied to agriculture mirrored what the Soviet power system wanted to hear as well. The Mendelian genetics, on the other hand, mutations are a random event, and then we have a selection process that's gone through and so forth. That's not controlled by an environmental change. And so it meant that if you adopted that science, you were looking at a very long time before the Russian masses could come into communism. And so there was a political layer that Lysenko was able to play to, and that Stalin was very keen on adopting, because he was the one, much more than Lenin, that was forcing such a rapid change on the population. So we have this compounding effect, if you will, of a politically motivated science that in the end destroyed Russian agriculture long after Vavilov was dead. Lysenko continued in power for many years after that. So we have something that, on the one hand, was politically expedient for Stalin, because it also let him scapegoat Vavilov later on for part of the famine problems that were reoccurring in Russian history. And if you look at the worst of those, they occurred in 1921 to 22. 32 to 33 was the period where Stalin was forcing collectivization of the farms, particularly in the Ukraine. And in that period, millions of people died from starvation. And in fact, it was almost a genocidal effect on the population in the Ukraine. And Stalin's could scapegoat Vavilov by saying, your progress isn't fast enough. You haven't given me the tools. You're spending too much time on germplasm collections and going around and collecting things that will have no value to us. Whereas on the other hand, he actually worked with Lysenko on the opposing speech, and that talked about speed, rapidity, changing things in one generation by the environment changing, and using vernalization as a model, in a sense, for olive crop improvement. Well, it just didn't work. And in 46 and 47, there was another massive famine. And during the years of Lysenko's administration, as I mentioned, the agricultural research got even worse. So that is how these things interrelate. But the important point is really that this is a signal or a sign of what happens when science becomes politicized, and we start to take out the people that are embedded in a long history of professionalism and research, and replace them with people that look like they could give us an expediency to an answer. And of course, that has many ramifications for coming out of our past presidential cycle, where science was also so much put on the back burner. And that was a consequence of that in Russia, was that agriculture really couldn't contribute in the time that was needed or wanted or expected by those in power.
Hi everyone, I hope you're enjoying the show. Interested in learning more? Joel's article, Varietal Timelines and Leadership Challenges Affecting the Legacy of Nikolai Ivanovich Vavilov, published in Crop Science, will be freely available for the next 2 weeks. The societies are also hosting Seed Week from March 22nd through the 26th. Check out our show notes for a link to our Seed Week landing page, where you'll find links to papers, K-12 activities, videos, news stories, and more, or check out our Sustainable Secure Food blog for our seed-related blog series. Thanks again also to our sponsors, Gazmat Technologies and Meter Group. For Gazmat Technologies, conduct greenhouse gas flux measurements in the field using the GT5000 Terra. Weighing 20.7 pounds, splash-proof IP54 rated, internal pump and battery, and vibration resistant, the GT5000 Terra is a robust and portable multi-gas analyzer for fieldwork. Visit www.gazmat.com or email sales@gazmat.com for more information. Meter specializes in robust soil moisture sensing, innovative weather monitoring, cloud data logging, advanced data visualization software, and more. Their well-published scientific instrumentation is used worldwide in universities, research and testing labs, government agencies, agriculture, and industrial applications. Find world-class webinars about the science behind environmental measurements at metergroup.com/fieldlabearth. Thank you for being our sponsor. Let's get back to the show. Yeah, obviously very, just heartbreaking, the starvation and the amount of people that died from that. And I think that kind of leads us into our next question, which is kind of about Vavilov's ultimate fate within his lifetime, at least, as well as some of the other scientists that he worked with. So he, as you had mentioned before, did establish kind of one of the first and oldest seed banks in the world, was part of his work, as well as advancing these sciences in his lifetime. But then things, as you mentioned, in kind of that third period really did take a pretty downward turn. I promise things will get better, listeners. By the end, we'll turn things around to something a little more optimistic and hopeful. But what ultimately happened to him in his lifetime?
All right, so let's look a little bit at where he was when these very tragic events started to take place. He had become the institute director of the of the agricultural system in Russia. That meant that many, many different types of institutes were under his direction. At the same time, he was pioneering these collection trips that began early on in his career to countries all over the world. He personally visited over 50, and he was bringing this material back. And during these visits, he was one of the first people to pick up on the fact of what we now call genetic erosion, which meant that as modern agriculture came in, we ran the risk of losing many of the indigenous land races and extant planting materials that were in these regions. And if they were not collected, we would lose that genetic potential that existed in these particular materials. And so Vavilav at the time was not just collecting and bringing seed back, but he was inventing how this should all be processed. What are the steps and stages of a full genetic resource program? And we have the seed bank really kind of officially getting open around the 1940s. And so he has that going on. He has all his directorship responsibilities. And at the same time, he's become a very prodigious academic. And in fact, he's often called Academician Vavilov. And he has a number of papers that are still referred to in plant breeding courses and agronomic courses, even to this day. Most importantly, perhaps, is the one on locating centers of origin and diversity for our crop plants. So we have all of these things going on in his life, but unfortunately, many of these things occurred under Lenin's administration. Lenin saw all the potential in Vavilov and realized that if the revolution was going to succeed, that type of agriculture was going to be a bedrock portion of that. But Lenin died under very mysterious conditions, and Stalin came to power in 1927, and that is when his rapid mobilization of the country in different directions than the Bolsheviks may have imagined and so forth began. And that was when he began to see Vavilov's type of agriculture as a hindrance because nothing was happening fast enough. And he became a convenient scapegoat for these failures. I think you can see that from Vavilov's record, everything that he was involved in, the faith put in him by Lenin, by professional publishers, by the people that worked for him, that really there wasn't a failure there. The failure really was this whole issue of time, agronomic time versus the political time. Well, eventually it just came to a boiling point, and Vavilov was actually abducted during one of his collection trips. The secret police waited intentionally until he was away from his home base, so to speak, and all of his colleagues, and he was taken and never seen again. All of his imprisonment and so-called trials, interrogation, all of that was behind carefully closed doors, so there was no access to him. People, even his family, really didn't even know where he was. So by 1941, he was imprisoned and treated very harshly there because they were trying to get him to sign confessionals that he had been spying for the Allied forces, that he had been contributing information that he shouldn't have been doing, that he was delaying agriculture rather than hastening it, that he was working with a genetic system that really was not compatible with the Soviet system, and so forth. They had a list of crimes that they brought against him, including being a traitor to the state. Well, Vavilov tried to maintain his scientific integrity through all of this, and so he was reluctant to sign any of these documents, one, because they were false, and two, because it was renouncing the science that he had become invested in ever since his trip to England and study with Bateson. And he just would not relent during this process, and eventually died of starvation alone. He was in solitary confinement, as far as we understand, in 1943. When he died, he was placed in an unmarked grave. The area is known, and there's a marker there now, but I still don't know if his actual gravesite was discovered. And at that time, he was then removed from all the official records of Russian scientific accomplishments and the history of Russia and so forth. He was taken out of the the Great Soviet Encyclopedia. His name and publications were removed. But parallel to these latter developments was also the siege of Leningrad. And during that time, we have, what's called the 900-day siege, went from September 1941 through January of 1944, where the Russians, interestingly enough, removed a great deal of art from Leningrad, but they didn't touch the seed bank. So you can imagine from the scenes I described earlier of the impending starvation that was already prone to affecting the Russian citizens. Well, during the war it got worse, and during the siege of Leningrad it was probably the worst. It's been called the most destructive blockade ever during a world war. And for that period of time, the Germans literally more or less had Leningrad surrounded, and people obviously had a very difficult time growing, harvesting, collecting, processing any type of foods. So here, just in the center of town almost, you have a gene bank sitting loaded with seed. Well, that didn't become general knowledge, but became knowledge enough that that seed had to be protected. And through either shelling or starvation or catastrophic calamities inside there, 9 of the gene bank scientists died. The others carried on and did not eat any of the protected seed that Vavilav and all of they had collected over all these years. And at the end of the war, the seed bank was there. It had survived. Of course, Lysenko didn't pay much attention to this. To him, this was just not necessary, and the real attention was paid elsewhere, so the gene bank suffered, but it still maintained its continuity through the war, after the war, until it itself became regenerated over the next maybe 5 to 10 years. So a terrible loss of life, a terrible degree of bravery, and the people that survived often spoke of the fact of as if Vavilov was there with them in the gene bank. But he, of course, didn't know this tragic story was occurring because he was isolated from all news of the war and what was happening around him. So a very tragic end to the people that lost their lives inside that gene bank, a very tragic end to Vavilov's life, that it was done in such a way that he really kind of, in the way he was treated, took on all this scapegoating that Stalin needed to try to pull the blame off the collectivization and so forth and place it on one singular individual.
Gosh, what a tragedy. That's just heartbreaking. That's so sad. Yeah. So, obviously a lot of heartbreak in that time period, a lot of very sad things happening. But as I did mention, things did get better eventually. So I think that kind of brings us to our next section, which is kind of that fourth phase you mentioned, which is his rehabilitation under Khrushchev, as well as kind of maybe his ongoing legacy and contributions today, obviously with the seed bank, and just kind of being brought back into the historic fold, as it were. So can you tell us more about that?
Sure. So Stalin died in 1953, and Khrushchev, it took a while to settle things out after Stalin died. Khrushchev came to power in 1955, and it was under his direction that these rehabilitation hearings and so forth really began to gather steam and take off. And Vavilov's name was brought before him, and in 1955, he was officially rehabilitated. Now, it took some time, of course, for that news to spread, and there were many subsequent honors placed upon Vavilov after this occurred. He was finally reinstated into Russian history. His papers were brought back into Russia. Of course, some of them had made it out to the West, and so they had remained there, but inside Russia, this was extremely important. And in 1977, we have a commemorative stamp that was issued by Russia marking his anniversary. And so you really begin to see things open up in that period. And that in 1987, that would have been the birth centenary, another postal issuance was produced, and that was celebrated in Moscow as a major event and conference, and that ended 44 years of official silence about Vavilov. At this same time, the West also became able to become re-involved with the gene bank, with Vavilov's life, and there began to be a lot of cross relationship between the two worlds, and Vavilov then became celebrated in a number of articles in the West, his life and his heritage and so forth. And of course, if we look at the gene bank itself, it's the longest continuing standing a genetic exchange operation of that scale that we have. And as you realize now, it did that throughout the war periods and other times of turbulence in the Russian political development, and is still operational and has grown immensely from Vavilov's time until the present day. While Vavilov was able to collect over 500 species that were in the gene bank at his time, Now there are over 330,000 accessions in that bank, and it bears his name. So the gene bank is now named actually after Vavilov, which is in itself a great honor, as well as our other monuments and places in Russia where he lived and worked. Right now, if you think of, well, how many gene banks are there? How important is this? There's obviously some different opinions on this, but in one of the latest United Nations studies of this, over 600 gene banks and now over 4.6 million individual accessions of genetic material are housed inside these banks. So what Vavilov really did was be able to set something in motion in all different parts of his life, that even though he was shut off from things historically, his message still remained there. And so this has been a tremendous importance in terms of why his life takes on such great importance. We have his academic work that I mentioned is still studied. We have a concept for how a gene bank develops and is formed and it becomes operational that really was tried out during his years. So if you think of beginning something from scratch, any project you might have at home, at work, it's very difficult when you're the first one to get something going and there's no model sitting in front of you with directions. This is what Vavilov faced in almost every one of the challenges in his life and overcame. So after that, the kind of operating system of a gene bank really began to fall into place, but was very much based on what he was able to do, not just as a theoretician or as a geneticist, but as a practitioner, as somebody that went in and worried about, could he warm up the rooms where his workers were working because it was so cold there? Was he going to inventory all of this seed coming in from later collections? Collecting trips were going out with his staff, not even himself. So more seed was coming in. And he then came up with the understanding then of these centers of diversity and began to have an overriding systematic way of collecting as well as storage. And preservation then, how is it he was going to ensure all this seed was going to be alive generations down the road, and began to be able to grow this out and check it for their characteristics and so forth. All of this was pioneered, and along with, as I said, the academic record. So we have this tremendous value that came from his life, even though it was cut so short by such tragic events. We're left with a history of a practitioner, of an academic, of a visionary that is a very difficult combination to find in many people. So what do gene banks do today? Well, they collect, and he explored that. They characterized. He had fields and fields of areas, particularly for characterization related to plant immunity. He conserved. He had different ways of exploring how the seed was conserved at the bank. Regeneration, to check for the replenishment and increasing the seed stocks, and then the distribution. So all of that was able to be pioneered, if not during his time, later on by continuing the work that he had started. So we're left as a people of the world, we're left with a tremendous legacy from this singular individual.
Yeah, absolutely. A life well lived and very inspiring. I was going to ask you kind of for a high level, like, why is this important? But I feel like all of that, I mean, everything you just said is why it's so important to know about Vavilov, and also his cohorts in the siege. I know you have talked about that there is a need for maybe some more ongoing work or honors for him. So I did want to give you an opportunity to talk about that. Where are we today?
So that's a great question. And early on, the International Center that explores the relationships of genetic resources and crop biodiversity, if you will, instigated a series of awards that are the Vavilav Awards, and these are made. And there's been other acknowledgments of Vavilav's importance, as I said, in Russia. They now have many things named after him, and postal awards and so forth. But my thought is that if we looked at Vavilov's life as if he hadn't died so tragically and suddenly, much more would have been accomplished and much more of a defined legacy would be left. We've been left to kind of reconstruct many of this because Vavilov's parting message to us wasn't the story of his life. It was the story of the academic things that he was working on right up until his death. And so I began to wonder if there was not some more global way of recognizing this individual who is recognized within various institutes and places, such as with our own national seed storage system and so on. And the one that came to mind is the World Food Prize. And I think here is an opportunity. Now, the World Food Prize has a kind of an overriding thought that they will not award to posthumously to individuals because, well, at least one reason, they want the recipients to be part of the ceremony and the program and the dialogues and seminars and so on that go on during the awarding of the prize. And that's perfectly understandable. But if you look at comparative situations, in the Nobel Prize, for example, they are beginning to consider this. If you look at the case of Rosalind Franklin, a tragic death before the award that went to Watson and Crick, there's been a lot of attention paid to that. This may seem a little off base, but I don't think so. If you look at the Baseball Hall of Fame, they do make awards posthumously, and they recognize the fact that people aren't always alive when they're ready or have recognized their importance. I think this is an important statement. We are alive now. We do recognize what this individual has contributed. Is it not time that a more global statement about the value of what this person has left humanity be recognized somehow? And as you know, in the Nobel Prize, there is not really anything in agriculture. It's one of the reasons that Norman Borlaug won the Peace Prize. Not that the two didn't go together, but that there's not a direct kind of food-related prize, which is another part of the thinking, I would guess, behind the World Food Prize. So as I look around, to me, globally recognizing this contributor to humanity, that would be the most important place from which it could come.
Sure. Yeah. Obviously, food for thought, further questioning there. And yeah, just such a rich subject with so many facets to dig into, obviously with his life in general, to which I think we should maybe move on to our last three questions that I have for you. The first of which being, if people want to learn more about Nikolai Vavilov and his life and his work, where can they go to learn more?
Well, I think there's a number of places depending on how much one wants to go in terms of the real academic type literature. But if you want to kind of capture the story of his life, I think there's 3 books that would be valuable. 2 are about him, and one is himself. And that's Selected Writings of Vavilav, and this was published in 1951. by the Ronald Press, and it contains over 360 pages of Vavilov's own writings, and of course in English. And this came out as a special in English volume, and it's a fantastic resource for really looking at these different epochs in his life and the different things that he was studying and becoming kind of an expert in. The second one is by Gary Nobham, and this is called Where Our Food Comes From. And Gary actually went out on a quest to try to retrace Vavilov's look in many countries in relation to famine. So I would recommend that. And the third one is The Murder of Nikolai Vavilov, and this is by Peter Pringle. And this is a larger book, but it's a story of Stalin's persecution of Vavilov, and really kind of opening that whole dialogue up and in many ways setting the record straight. But it also is a nice biography of his life as well. So I think those are three very good sources. In terms of the commemorative honors, I had a paper published a couple of years ago that is very important in that regard. It's the first paper to really look at all the commemorative awards that have come out for him and how they came about and their time cycle. So I would say any of those would be a fantastic starting place.
Excellent. We will include links to all of those in our show notes, as well as, of course, your current paper on which this talk is based. Second question is, if people want to get involved with any of these issues, maybe it's not exactly related to Vavilov himself, but kind of these related issues, how can people get involved?
Well, I would say one way to begin would be the International Center that's devoted to crop biodiversity. As I mentioned, they are the ones that make the Vavilov Award, and they also deal with what's called genetic resources for food and agriculture, or plant genetic resources. And there's ways that you can help sponsor different parts of that program, and also help with the sustaining of that international dimension of a genetic resource work. So I think that would be a very good way. Also, I think of making people aware. Continuing the educational process around Vavilov's life is very important. This is one of the things I brought into the classroom when I was teaching, and tried to bring in his life in our units on evolution. So there's a tremendous opportunity there for those of people in professional, academic, educational places to really begin to explore his life, but also to enrich the lives of others by sharing it with them. So I think those would be two things that I can think of that would be most possible. The other way would be to think of endangered species as kind of an extension of the genetic erosion that Vavilov was so concerned about. And there's many ways to help support organizations that are fighting to preserve both the agricultural and the wildlife biodiversity that is still present on the planet. So there's three ways I think that would be very valuable, each of them.
Great. Thank you. Those are wonderful ways to get involved. So then final question for you is, what is one fun fact that people would not know about you if all they had was your research?
They probably wouldn't know I'm a fossil collector, and I think that would be a good one. And if you could see my room, they're all over the walls, and when people come in, they're a little taken aback by everything that's in the room, but very proud of it. Everything tells a story. They've been collected from many different places, everything from dinosaur eggs to more recent events in our fossil record. But I think it's fascinating to follow this chain of time and think about where we are as very recent participants in that, and also then in relation to extinction. What obviously we have all the natural extinctions that occurred, but now we're in a time when we have many extinctions that are occurring because of us. So the fossils kind of help tell that story, and that would be my. I don't think people would be aware of that.
Sure. Do you have a favorite fossil?
Yeah, my 2 footprints from a meat-eating dinosaur that came from Hadley, Massachusetts. There's a fascinating place there. Hadley is kind of halfway between Boston and Amherst, and a gentleman owns a particular plot of land that's been in his family where dinosaurs literally walked right through this, what has become shale sediment, and he can go right out literally almost as like his backyard and unearth these. And we went out and spent a day with him, and I have 2 of them that I came back with. It was very exciting.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Really
How fun.
fantastic guy and a fantastic place to visit.
Well, great. Yeah, I guess listeners, if you're out that way, go check out some dinosaur footprints. How fun. Well, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us today on really an incredible, complicated human situation. Thank you so much for being on our show.
Well, I'm very pleased to have been here. I'm very happy that Crop Science Society and so forth has allowed the time to talk about such an important person. So thank you, and thank the societies.
Thank you for listening to Field Lab Earth. You'll find links to today's resources in our show notes or on our website. If you have any questions, comments, or recommendations for show topics, please contact us at podcast@sciencesocieties.org or on Twitter @FieldLabEarth. If you'd like to hear more content like this, please subscribe, and don't forget to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Podchaser, Stitcher, or anywhere else you find your podcasts if you like our show. We're also available on Lyceum, the world's first audio learning community, where you can join our discussion group and comment on each episode. This podcast is a joint production of the American Society of Agronomy, Crop Science Society of America, and Soil Science Society of America. Special thanks to Lobo Loco for the use of their song Spook Castle on the intro and outro of our show. Opinions and conclusions expressed by guests are their own and are not considered as those of the American Society of Agronomy, Crop Science Society of America, Soil Science Society of America, its staff, its members, or its advertisers.